Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Lots of love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to sharing this lovely story with you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to get that perfect drink for yourself, whether you're enjoying something alcoholic, something refreshing and light, something warm and comforting. Go and get it because I've got a fabulous story. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the last time I'd seen Anna Baroque was at a local Take the Plunge event in our small rural town. The event was birthed from a random competition hosted by our local cheese shop to see who could make the best chutney. The winner would receive $1,000, along with their chutney recipe becoming commercialized, sold across all of North America, at upmarket delicatessences and select food shops nationwide. The spontaneous event soon morphed into all other kinds of competitions, as inspired shop owners got on the bandwagon, using this quintessential opportunity to offer their own competitions, all in the name of branding, promotion, and free advertising. Everyone in our small town was taking part. Even the butcher had a specialised competition for the best barbecue and hot sauces, while the greengrocer had a competition for the best homegrown vegetables. But it wasn't based on their size, but on the taste of the vegetables, I'm glad to say, as at the end of the day, it truly is the flavour that counts. The baker had a competition for the best pineapple upside-down cake, the best cheesecake, the best chocolate brownies, and the best Boston cream pie. Then there were prizes for the best vanilla fudge, shortbread and chocolate chip cookies, so everybody was very excited about this upcoming illustrious event. I remember people were bustling around our small town, buying the ingredients to rustle up unusual recipes to see who could turn out the best chutney or the best upside-down pineapple cake. The competitive spirit was ablaze in our small town, rather like the dazzling bright lights of a Christmas tree. For even if they weren't ready to admit it, everybody wanted to be a winner. I remember my mother made 5 batches of chutney, each far worse than the previous one, as she tried to concoct these weird and wonderful flavours that certainly did not work together. But I guess one could commend her for being rather creative, industrious and imaginative. For indeed, one of her chutneys was so hot, I thought it would literally blow my head off. My mother's grandmother originally came from England, so she always told us the story about Bakewell tart. It would seem that Mrs. Geeves, who was a landlord of the White Horse Inn in 1820, left instructions for her chef to make a jam tart. Instead of stirring the almond paste in the recipe and adding it to the pastry, he put it on top of the tart, alongside the jam. It tasted so good, even though it was a mistake, and now Bakewell tart is sold in bakeries throughout Britain. My mother made it for us once. It was absolutely delicious. It's a tart filled with cake and jam, covered with fondant. I think my mother assumed that she could come up with a brilliant, innovative, genius recipe, completely out of this world, rather like Mrs. Jeeves's cook had done, with his enthralling, outstanding, smashing recipe for Bakewell tart. I think she envisaged she would knock everybody's socks off, but so far she was failing miserably at every attempt. "Maybe you're just being rather adventurous, sweetheart," my father had spouted, when he was forced to taste one of my mother's masterpieces and was less than enthused about the idea, as my mother's chutneys became less and less palatable as the experiment ensued. "Well," said my mother excitedly, "how does it taste?" "Not very good, I'm afraid, sweetheart," said my father very honestly. "I can see that aniseed in a chutney on the surface may sound very appealing, very interesting, but licorice and cheese, I'm sorry, they don't work together." "Well, how do you know that they don't actually work? Other people might like it," she protested indignantly. "I think, sweetheart, that it is very unlikely that aniseed will go down well with the community. You should perhaps focus on simplicity. Have you not heard the saying that less is most definitely more? If you put too many flavours in your chutney, I think they can fight each other." "Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Frank. The whole idea of this competition is to come up with an ingenious idea." "If you say so, dear," said my father, raising a brow. as he caught my eye. He rolled his eyes in the back of his head. I giggled. I knew he was saying that my mother was being deliberately contrary. There was no reasoning with her, or bringing her to her senses. I remember rewinding the day of the competition in my mind to the moment when the 3 judges tasted my mother's chutney after sampling a sea of other chutneys before they finally reached hers, where the names of all the participants were now concealed. I waited with bated breath, my heart in my mouth, as they dipped their biscuits into her syrupy concoction. At first they discussed the texture and appearance of the chutney, all nodding in agreement. I could tell that they were impressed with how the jam-like substance dribbled from the spoon. I watched all 3 judges' eyes grow round in astonishment as they politely chewed my mother's chutney, hurriedly swallowing the biscuit down as if they were about to choke on it. They eagerly glugged down some water to extinguish the flavour. I could determine by the disgusted expressions on their faces that they wanted to spit it out, but they were politely determined to not cause any offence. My mother looked absolutely mortified, while my father tried to refrain from laughing out loud. One of the judges said, "Interesting. I've never tasted a chutney quite like this before." I never dared ask my mother what was in it, but I could only imagine. In the end, my father was absolutely right. The person who won the competition for the best chutney was Mrs. Claire Armstrong Jones, who made a very simple peach chutney recipe that she found in an old 1800s recipe book, so perhaps the classic recipes are the safest after all. Going back to Anna Baroque, she was not the kind of person you would miss in a hurry, for she dressed in loud, lurid, gaudy colours, usually blazing obtrusive reds, pinks, yellows and oranges, while her reticent, polite husband was overshadowed by her at every single turn. I think that was the whole point, really. Mrs. Baroque simply loved being the centre of attention. Imagine a bright, flamboyant, colourful painting for a moment that is so vibrant, so eye-catching in its colour. It grabs you so much that the softer, subdued and subtle colours in the background simply fade away. Her husband was the soft background colour that was almost surplus to requirements, so to speak. He would rarely be observed, and would just shrink in the background like a blot on the landscape. People would often ponder after they'd encountered Anna Baroque as to whether Jacques had actually been with her or not when they'd last seen her. It almost always escaped their minds, but invariably he had been there, but no one had even noticed him. One almost felt sorry for the poor man, who was rarely ever acknowledged by the locals. As any skilled artist is likely to tell you, it's very often the background colours of a painting that serve to enhance, to uplift the vibrancy of the work, with a blended sequence of tonal contrasts, variants and shades. For indeed sometimes these colours are the most significant of all, as they add great depth to the work. In the same way I truly believe Mrs. Baroque would have been nothing without her husband Jacques, despite the fact that he seemed so innocuous. My father always thought Mrs. Baroque looked like a chicken. She carried her ample weight around her middle, that was buttressed by the skinniest legs that you've ever seen. Sometimes it was hard to believe that her tiny thin pins could actually hold her up. The brassy woman was loud, obnoxious in every way, not afraid to air her dirty laundry in public. On the contrary, she enjoyed publicising the contentious issues that arose in her personal life. She spoke her mind, never afraid to say exactly what she thought, which invariably caused offence among many of the locals, who sometimes took her cutting remarks quite personally. It would seem she acquired for herself a long list of enemies. She was not well liked in our small town, yet you could never ever avoid her, nor ignore her. She was like that unfortunate tree fallen over by the storm in the middle of your road, blocking your path home. It was not uncommon on a Sunday after church to see Mrs. Baroque mouthing her opinion on every single matter, from the quality of the sermon, to the taste of the food, to the clothes the people were wearing that morning. Regretfully, her critical observant comments were rarely generous, but more likely rude, offensive, and even unkind. I don't think she meant to cause upset, but she had about as much tact as an alley cat, and the subtlety of a bull elephant standing in your living room, larger than life. "Oh, it's my husband who's boring you," she would say, intruding in on our conversation when people had gathered together for a chat. "I'm afraid he's very, very dull, but I'm the one that has to live with him, not you." On the day of the town hall gathering, I do remember Mrs. Baroque coming up to my mother in her bright, shimmering purple dress, wearing a big grin on her face. "What was in your chutney?" she asked my mother. "Whatever it was, the judges were quite simply appalled. Remind me to never come to your house for dinner, girl. You knocked their socks off, dear, but not in a good way, I'm afraid to say. You could market your chutney to use as gifts for people you don't like," she chuckled. "I might just buy one for you for my brother." That was the last time we'd seen Mrs. Baroque alive. Now we were being questioned by the sheriff in our home, as Mrs. Baroque had disappeared, gone missing, vanished off the face of the earth. No one knew where she was, nor did they really care either, as the town seemed quieter, more peaceful without her. Her husband had reported her missing. Tongues were wagging all over our small town. As rumours circulated, people speculated, theories abounded, ideas rocketed, people gossiped, and boy did they gossip. "He finally did her in," whispered Mrs. George. "I can't say I actually blame him. Poor, poor man. I think I'd have done the same, wearing his shoes, if I had to live with her. Maybe he put antifreeze in her jello, buried her under the patio." "That's a bit extreme," said Mr. Rogers. "I don't think Mr. Baroque would have done her in as you suggest. But it is decidedly odd, I have to admit. I mean, she wears such intrusive bright colours. She's larger than life, whatever you may say about her. She sticks out like a sore thumb wherever she goes. You can see her from miles away. Someone must have seen her, surely. People don't just vanish off the face of the earth like this, do they?" Of course, when Sheriff Jason Carter arrived at our home to question our family, we were the first to be surprised to hear about the disappearance of Mrs. Baroque. But the sheriff asked me, my younger sister Lorelei, and both of my parents when was the last time we'd seen her alive. "So the last time you saw Mrs. Baroque, you are saying you were at the Take the Plunge event hosted in the town on Sunday, am I right? You are sure about this? You didn't see her on the Misty Hill walking trail at any time, did you? I gather your family walk there sometimes with your dog. It's quite a remote trail, is it not? A little inconvenient to access for most of the locals, but certainly not for you." "Well, you're right about that, Sheriff. Our property borders the trail. Sheila here," he said, referring to me, "walks our little dog there. She just climbs through the square opening in the picket fence, while the little dog squeezes beneath. Awfully convenient, really." "That's right, sir," I said. "I take our miniature schnauzer for walks there, but I never see Mrs. Baroque there. If you're wondering, I would have noticed, sir. Well, Mrs. Baroque, she's always in your face. She's bright as a parrot, big, loud. Daddy calls her the parrot chicken, don't you, Daddy? Because she's so noisy, so bright." My father flushed bright pink and said nothing, but if looks could kill, he passed me a fleeting dagger look, as if to say, "Don't you dare make me look like a suspect in this missing case scenario, with a desire to do in Mrs. Baroque, to calm down the excessively bright scenery and the obtrusive background noise." "The last time I saw Mrs. Baroque, Sheriff Carter," said my mother, intervening, "was when she was being particularly rude to me about my chutney that I happened to enter in for the competition. I didn't take offence like most people would have done, because she's like that with everyone. She tells you exactly what she thinks, without that quintessential charcoal filter, so to speak, that cleanses away the nasty words before they begin to come out. Mrs. Baroque has no filter, Sheriff. I would be surprised if she went on the Misty Hill trail behind our home. That woman has never exercised a single day in her life. It's not a trail for the faint-hearted. It's actually quite steep. She would never venture down a trail like that, given her size, and of course her inadequate level of fitness, surely." "It would seem that is exactly what she did," said the sheriff. "I gather she recently went to the doctor, according to Mr. Baroque. Her blood work didn't come back good. The doctor encouraged her to start exercising forthwith." "Well, why would someone not fit attempt such a trail?" piped my mother. "It really doesn't make any sense at all, Sheriff. They're much more agreeable, flatter trails in these parts to attempt. Well, according to her husband, she didn't want to be seen by the locals. She feels rather self-conscious about her weight, so her husband dropped her off at the trailhead. He came back to collect her. She was gone. Wow, said my mother. Who would have thought Mrs. Baroque would be self-conscious? She's the most confident person I know. Demure and reticent, she most certainly is not. By any chance, Sheriff, did the police check her hiking route after she had attempted it? Maybe she had a stroke. It wouldn't surprise me if that were indeed the case. I mean, without wishing to be rude, it's a bit like asking a sloth to enter a marathon. I'm not saying that to be unkind, you must understand. But if she has overexerted herself, she could have had a heart attack. We've checked the hiking trail thoroughly. There are no signs of her anywhere. Do you think she was murdered, Sheriff? I asked. I mean, she wasn't popular. Someone could have done her in. Lots of people don't like her. I very much doubt she's been murdered, said the Sheriff. Granted, she is a difficult woman, rubbing up people the wrong way all the time. She's not everybody's cup of tea. But I think murder is very unlikely. Of course, we can't rule anything out yet, but I am inclined to think she had an accident. Or dare I say it, was attacked by a wild animal. I sincerely hope the latter is not the case. But, Sheriff, do you think she's dead? I piped. I hope not, but the longer she remains missing, the more we're forced to conclude that she may no longer be in life. I would like you, Sheila, to keep an eye out when you go hiking with your dog on that trail. Let me know if you see anything amiss or untoward. It can be anything. The littlest things can be very, very significant. Like a strip of material from Mrs. Baroque's gymming clothes, clinging to a branch. It helps us to piece together what may have become of the poor woman. I would take some bear spray, though, if I was you, just to be safe, because you don't know what is hanging out in those woods. Thanks, Sheriff, I said. I will. A week went by, and no one had seen sight or sound of Anna Baroque. I will say that Jacques Baroque didn't appear to be missing his wife very much, which only fueled speculation among the locals that he might have had something to do with his wife's mysterious disappearance. I just think that he was finally able to breathe after she was out of his way, as he had been suffocated by her for so long with her larger-than-life personality. He had almost become obsolete, lost in the background when she was around. Now people were beginning to notice him again as an individual in his own right, and not Mrs. Baroque's accessory that accompanied her everywhere, rather like a toy dog in a purse. It was on a Thursday morning when I woke up earlier than usual. I glanced out of the window of our double-storey symmetrical home. I could see that there was a gentle breeze blowing, as the towering oak trees scattered around our property were swaying like graceful tall ladies under the vast expanse of the bleached sky. The sun had risen gently. The crisp, fragrant morning was basked in its first light, while the verdant lawn shimmered with a silvery dew. My little schnauzer began to whimper excitedly, his bright button eyes literally begging me for a walk. "All right, Frisky," I said. "We'll go for a walk." He responded by jumping up and down in delight, mounting my leg with his tail wagging furiously. Frisky knew the word walk as well as his own name. I might as well get up early, I thought. I'm awake now. I put on my gym pants, a cotton t-shirt and a pair of trainers. I hurried down the sweeping staircase, taking particular care to be as quiet as I possibly could, with Frisky running ahead of me, as there wasn't room enough for the boisterous enthusiasm that was coursing now through his smooth silken grey form. I glided through the open-plan living room, towards the kitchen that framed its furthest corner, behind the kitchen counters, towards the back door. I closed it carefully behind me. I could feel a cool air blowing vigorously against my face as I bounded towards the picket fence that fringed the edge of our property and the head of the hiking trail. I hurriedly climbed through the middle square, bending my body through it, while Frisky scampered beneath the lowest square, squeezing himself under it. We crossed a tiny little clearing, finally entering the hiking trail in the woodgrove. I loved it here. It was so private. Although it was accessible to the public, it was barely ever used. It was hard to believe that this was the last place where Mrs. Baroque had been seen alive. I had been looking for any signs of her, but had not found any evidence that she had been here at all. Soon all thoughts of Mrs. Baroque were expunged from my mind, as this intoxicating forest drew me into her loving arms, rather like a mother embracing her long-lost child. I was so enjoying this tranquil retreat, as a lone red fox darted past me, eyeing me ever so curiously, while Frisky released a couple of excited yaps upon seeing the sleek red creature with its magnificent full tail of puffed-up red hair. The forest was flooded with the cheerful tweets of the dawn chorus, as if welcoming the beginning of a brand new day with all the opportunities it presented. For the songbird, it might be how many grubs he pecked out of the ground this morning, and for the squirrel, how many acorns he collected for his winter storage, and as for every single human being on the planet, it might be where their path would take them today. Little did I know that mine was not going to be a standard run-of-the-mill day. On the contrary, it was a day that I would be unlikely to ever forget, as its indelible mark would be imprinted on my mind like a tattoo forever, never to be erased or ever forgotten. Frisky and I travelled down the winding path, through the towering tall Douglas fir trees that were liberally scattered throughout the woodgrove, towering into the sky like spectacular green giants. We trekked up the steep incline that was dotted with boulders, ferns, brush, moss, and flowering forest plants in pretty pinks, yellows, purples, and whites. All of a sudden, Frisky ran up to a large bramble bush and began scratching at it, dragging something out from beneath its boughs. It was a hand, a human hand, that was beginning to look black, as the first stages of decomposition had set in. I was amazed. It was still intact. It hadn't been demolished by a lone scavenger. Perhaps the sharp brambles of the thorn bush had prevented that from happening, I thought. Someone was screaming loudly. How I wished they would shut up. The shrill soprano noise was deafening. I remember wondering who was making such an acute, raucous commotion, when I suddenly realised that it was me. I was the one that was screaming like a banshee. The sight of the gruesome, macabre, decomposing hand had rattled me more than I cared to realise. I was the one that had filled the forest with my high-pitched screams that reverberated, penetrating the forest like a powerful, blasting horn, waking everything up that was in earshot. In a trice, everything in the forest became hushed. The bird song subsided. It evaporated like a subtle, indefinite, ethereal smell that suddenly fades. Even the wind subsided, retreating from whence it came. I had never known the forest like this before. I was so startled I stopped screaming. Even Frisky was growling, as if she felt threatened by something that I was unable to discern. But I could sense the presence of something big, powerful, mighty. But what, I could not imagine. That was when I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched by a pair of unseen eyes. But I glanced around the forest, seeing nothing. It is a creepy, discomposing feeling when you sense that. It sends chills down your spine, as you feel in your gut that something is wrong, very, very wrong. In a trice, barrelling through the wood green like a rhino hurtling through the thicket, trampling down everything in its wake, from branches to fallen leaves, ferns, brush, was a colossal humanoid creature, bearing a slight resemblance to an ape that was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. My miniature schnauzer was so terrified she bolted through the woods, making her way back home as quickly as she could, sparing very little regard for her owner. Looking back, I think the creature had come thundering through the forest to see who it was that was screaming. I probably sounded like someone in trouble, as my screams were ear-piercingly loud, even though at the time I was not aware of them myself. Unwittingly, I had drawn attention to myself from a creature that I would as sooner have avoided, for this thing was intimidating, powerful, daunting. In its presence I felt tiny, inconspicuous, helpless, fragile, like a doll that just might break, for this creature dwarfed me by its gargantuan, monstrous size. It was female. It looked paternal, protective even towards me, with deep-set dark eyes, of a very human-like face. She scanned me curiously. It was as if she was concerned about my welfare, which really was quite extraordinary, I thought. I'd never seen a creature like this before. She was so human, only much bigger than the average man, taller, wider, fuller, and much more muscular, covered with long flowing brown hair, the colour of a black bear. She possessed a cone-shaped head, a very short neck, and large gargantuan shoulders. All of a sudden this outlandish creature stood still, standing like a silent statue, frozen in time. It was as if she was listening to the forest, rather like a dog with its ears perked up. She was behaving exactly like that, when they discern a noise that no one else can hear. The creature grabbed me. With her overlong arms she bustled me away, guiding me to behind a tree. I should have screamed out in terror, but I didn't. I knew she was being protective of me. I thought maybe a mountain lion was loitering around, but why would a creature of her power and stature be intimidated by such a creature? It must be something else, I wondered. But what? That was when I saw Mrs. Baroque's only brother, Herman, entering the woods. He was a large, hefty, sizable man who, like his sister, carried the vast majority of his weight around his middle section. But he did not possess her world-famous skinny legs. His head was bald, framed by a thick hedge of black hair around its outer perimeters. His eyes were deep-set and mean, buried beneath layers and folds of fat. What was he doing here, I wondered? He was from Maine and New Hampshire, not our part of the world. I knew he rarely ever visited his sister here in the Pacific Northwest, and they weren't exactly on good speaking terms either. I remember Mrs. Baroque described her only brother as a weasel. I hid behind a tree with this creature standing guard over me. I was so glad of her company, because Herman was a dubious character at the best of times. I remember I always thought of him as shifty. He had a large spade in his hands, along with a hunting rifle. He began to dig a hole that was deep, large enough for a dead body. He was heaving, sweating, breathing heavily as he dug, wiping away the sweat that was trickling down his brow. I think he thought that being up with the sparrows he would not be observed. Why had he not done this a long time ago, I thought. That was when it hit me like a brick to the head that Herman was responsible for Mrs. Baroque's death. But why? He was the one guilty of her murder, but it did not make any sense to me at all. What did he have to gain over her death? There was a pile of dried timbers laid on top of each other under a large ponderosa pine at the edge of the woods. That was when I saw Herman removing these stacked branches, which were covering a long, vertical, lumpy object, draped in a blue material. Within seconds, the forest was hit with the most repugnant, revolting, repulsive, offensive, objectionable smell of death and decay. Indeed, it was so abhorrent I wanted to heave and vomit, but by some miraculous miracle I managed to keep it together. You never forget a loathsome smell like that. It stays with you forever. The creature next to me was having difficulty dealing with the smell. She was covering her nose with an expression of disgust on her face, all the while beckoning for me to remain very still, which was exceedingly difficult to accomplish in these odorous conditions. She kept pointing to Herman's rifle, and then to me. She imitated him shooting. I think she might have actually witnessed Herman kill his only sister. She was protecting me from him, worried that I would succumb to the same fate. I was grateful she was watching me. I felt safe in her charge. The smell was so bad that Herman began throwing up violently over the ground. He was retching, heaving, and almost shaking from the convulsions caused by spewing his guts. Once he finally managed to compose himself, he began to slide a long blue sleeping bag cover over the forest floor with a hole in the area where a handless arm was dangling out in the bag. I watched him drag the sleeping bag, kicking the corpse into the open hole, beginning to cover it with soil and then with fallen branches. Finally, Herman walked away from the forest. I heard an engine start up as he drove away. I've never been so relieved to see anyone leave the forest in all my life as I was to see him go. The anomalous humanoid creature was so terribly kind to me. She was way too emotionally intelligent to be an animal. She was so sharp, perceptive, discerning, and much cleverer than a lot of people I know. I could tell that by nature she was reserved, but regardless of her reticence, she escorted me to our picket fence to make sure that I was safely returned home. I ran into the house to tell my parents what I'd seen. I willfully admitted the part about the anomalous creature I encountered, partly to protect her from human scrutiny, and partly because I doubted I would be believed anyway. Before long, there was yellow crime scene tape over parts of the forest, while the body of Mrs. Baroque was being dug up, removed by the police, transformed to the medical examiner, while an autopsy was performed on her. It was discovered that she had been hit with a hunting rifle in the lower abdomen. At first, Herman Baroque denied intentionally killing his sister, making out he'd been squirrel hunting while his sister was exercising in the forest. He claimed that while he was shooting a squirrel, his gun ricocheted and hit her in the lower abdomen. He had panicked and buried her body under some fallen timber. It would seem that he began to have nightmares of her body being recovered too soon, so he returned to the scene of the crime to bury her more efficiently, as he came to the conclusion that if he buried her, she might never, ever be found. Sheriff Carter informed me that Mrs. Baroque's brother had confessed to her murder in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. It turned out that Mrs. Baroque's only mother was dying of cancer with weeks left to live. She was dividing her vast inheritance between her son and her daughter. In the event of either party's death, all the money would be left to the remaining surviving sibling. No prizes for guessing that Herman wanted to inherit every last penny, so eliminating his sister from the equation was a great idea as far as he was concerned. Mrs. Baroque had actually phoned her brother, as advised by her doctor, to warn him about his genetic risks to heart disease that the blood tests had revealed, that potentially affected him as well. When he learnt about Mrs. Baroque exercising on a remote hiking trail, he knew that this was the perfect opportunity to exterminate her. I now realise that the creature I encountered that day in the woods was a Bigfoot. I believe she was the only eyewitness to Mrs. Baroque being murdered. When she realised he'd come into the woods again, she probably thought that my life was in danger and was determined to protect me. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.